All right, so get ready to dive into something pretty amazing. We're going to be talking about the Lapedo Child, a discovery that really shook things up in the world of human evolution.
Yeah, it was a big one.
Found in Portugal back in '98. It's a 28,000-year-old skeleton. And get this, it has features of both Neanderthals and modern humans.
It really highlights how much science is constantly changing.
Oh, for sure.
Back when they first found the Lapedo Child, the idea that Neanderthals and humans could have, interbred, well, it was pretty controversial. But now we have all these advancements like Neanderthal DNA sequencing, and now we know that interbreeding wasn't just some random, one-time thing.
Right.
It happened pretty regularly.
It makes you wonder if our ancestors were like swapping stories around the campfire and also like genes.
Exactly.
But let's talk about dating the skeleton.
Oh, yeah.
That was a real puzzle at first, wasn't it?
It really was. The bones were in great shape.
Yep.
And there was all this contamination from the environment, which messed up the traditional radiocarbon dating methods. It was like trying to put together a puzzle with like half the pieces missing.
Oh, I can imagine. But then this new technique comes along.
It was a game changer.
Compound-specific radiocarbon analysis.
CSRA.
CSRA, exactly.
Yeah.
So instead of analyzing the whole bone, this technique zooms in on a specific amino acid found in the collagen. And that gives you a much more accurate date. It's like, going from those old blurry photos to like a super high-definition picture.
A perfect analogy. And with CSRA, they found out that the Lapedo Child was actually around 28,000 years old.
Wow.
Which is wild because that's thousands of years later than anyone initially thought.
So it really changes the timeline for when Neanderthals and humans might have been, mixing it up.
Yeah.
I mean, picture this. Neanderthals were thought to have disappeared around 40,000 years ago, but here's the Lapedo Child, strutting around thousands of years later. Throws a wrench into the whole classic evolution story.
It really does, and it gets even more interesting. Researchers use CSRA to redate other items found in the grave, too.
Oh, okay. Like what?
So originally they found a rabbit skeleton, some red deer bones, and charcoal.
Gotcha.
Which led them to think it was a ritualistic burial.
No, I see. Like a little send-off with snacks for the afterlife. I dig it.
Right. But here's the twist. Turns out only the rabbit was actually buried with the Lapedo Child.
Wait, really?
The deer bones and the charcoal were much older. They were probably already in that cave long before the Lapedo Child.
So no elaborate ritual, just a bunny. I'm suddenly imagining some prehistoric kid, like, refusing to be buried without their pet rabbit.
That's one way to look at it. We can't know for sure, but the rabbit and the child date back to the same time, so it definitely seems like it was put there on purpose.
Makes you wonder what that rabbit meant to them, right? Was it, like, symbolic? A guide for the afterlife? Maybe prehistoric bunny slippers? Okay, probably not that last one. But seriously, what can we figure out from this one little furry detail?
It's a window into their burial practices, and maybe even their belief systems. It suggests they had pretty complex thought processes and rituals, not just like burying the dead.
Right, like finding a secret message scribbled in the margins of history, and we don't have the code to crack it. We know it's important, though.
Exactly. And remember, this was a time when humans were still sharing the world with Neanderthals. So this burial, with its mysterious rabbit friend, could tell us a lot about how those different groups interacted, maybe about the cultural exchanges happening between them.
So we have this fascinating hybrid individual.
Yeah.
Lived during a time when the human world and the Neanderthal world were, like, colliding.
Right.
We have this lone rabbit shrouded in mystery, and then we have this whole revised timeline.
Yeah.
All thanks to CSRA.
Yeah.
What a story.
And we're just getting started. The more we look at the details of this burial, the more intriguing it gets. Like, for example, there's that red ochre staining found on the bones.
Oh, yeah. What about that?
Wow. That red ochre staining is really important. Researchers think it means the Lapedo Child was buried in some kind of shroud, like covered in ochre.
Wait, like a full-body ochre onesie?
Maybe not a onesie, but definitely some kind of fabric or hide. Something that, like, completely wrapped the body.
Okay.
Because they found the staining on every single bone. If they had just sprinkled ochre on top, it wouldn't be like that.
So we've got a child carefully wrapped up, laid to rest in this rock shelter with a rabbit. It really paints a picture, It makes you wonder, like, what were those people thinking when they buried the child? Were they sad? Were they trying to, make the journey to the afterlife easier?
We can look at the evidence and guess. but we can't really know what was going on in their minds all those thousands of years ago. But we can learn a lot from what they left behind, you know?
That's true. And speaking of what they left behind, remember those deer bones? The ones that weren't part of a big afterlife feast like we thought at first? What do we think about those now? Did they just happen to be there, or could they have been part of the burial in some other way?
That's a great question. And even though those deer bones weren't like a fancy meal for the afterlife, they probably weren't just random leftovers either. There's a theory that maybe they used them as tools when they were digging the grave.
Okay, like caveman shovels. I can see it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, digging a grave in rocky ground, that can't be easy, even with our tools today.
Exactly. Every little detail adds to the story, right? And there's one more thing about the grave itself that I think you'll find pretty interesting. The team used CSRA to date the sediment layer where they found the Lapedo Child, and it turned out to be pretty surprising.
Now I'm really curious. What did they find out about the dirt?
Well, they found out that this specific layer of sediment built up really fast, like within a few centuries.
Wow, that's quick.
And here's the crazy part. That time of rapid sedimentation, it happened right when this huge climate shift started. It's called Greenland Stadial 4. And it was a time when temperatures just plummeted.
So the Lapedo Child was buried right when the climate was, like, taking a nosedive. Do you think that maybe that climate shift forced those people to find shelter in the cave?
It's definitely possible, and it really shows how everything is connected, even across thousands and thousands of years. We're not just looking at a bunch of separate events, but a whole web of environmental changes, cultural practices, and, human stories all woven together.
My mind is officially blown. This one burial. It's giving us a glimpse into prehistoric burial practices, symbolic thought, and a major climate event. It's incredible how much information we can get from a single archaeological site.
It really is. And it all comes back to the bigger picture of human evolution. The relationship between our ancestors and the Neanderthals.
Oh, right. We talked about the burial, the rabbit, the revised timeline. But what does it all tell us about how Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interacted?
Well, remember, this wasn't just a case of two separate groups keeping their distance. The Lapedo Child, with its mix of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens features, it points to something much closer, much more, intimate.
You're talking about interbreeding, right? Like not just a one-time thing, but something that went on for generations.
Exactly. And the fact that we find individuals like the Lapedo Child thousands of years after Neanderthals were supposed to be extinct, it really challenges that old idea that humans just replaced Neanderthals, like a clean break.
So it's a much more complicated story than we thought. It makes you wonder, what really happened to the Neanderthals? Did the two groups sort of merge over time? Or did modern humans just outcompete them for resources?
That's one of the biggest mysteries in paleoanthropology. And while the Lapedo Child doesn't give us all the answers, it does give us some really interesting clues. This discovery really makes us rethink what it means to be human and how our species came to be.
It's like we're finding missing chapters in the history books, and we're just starting to fill in the blanks.
Exactly. And who knows what other surprises we'll find. You mentioned earlier that there were some other human remains, potentially even older, that could benefit from this CSRA dating method.
Yeah.
What were those again?
Oh, yeah, those other discoveries. Remind me about them again.
Yeah.
The ones that could really benefit from this CSRA dating.
Well, there are the remains from the Mired caves in the Czech Republic.
Right.
Those are some of the oldest Homo sapiens remains found in Europe.
Oh, wow.
And the original dating put them at about 31,000 years old.
Okay.
But some people have questioned whether those dates are accurate because there might be some contamination issues like we saw with the Lapedo Child at first.
So CSRA could help us get a more accurate timeline for when Homo sapiens first showed up in Europe. That would be huge.
Absolutely. And then there's Aubry Petard in France. That site is really fascinating.
Why that?
It has all these layers of archaeological stuff,
Like what?
tools, artifacts. It covers like tens of thousands of years. There are Neanderthal tools and artifacts, early Homo sapiens tools, and even evidence that both groups were living there at different times.
It's like a prehistoric time capsule.
Exactly.
So CSRA could help us figure out which layer is from when, right?
Yeah, it could help us untangle all those layers, figure out who was there when, and maybe get a better idea of how those different groups interacted.
Fascinating. And what was that other site you mentioned? The one with the Neanderthal skeleton?
Oh, Saint-Césaire.
Right, Saint-Césaire. With, what was her name?
Pierrette.
Pierrette, yes. It's funny how a nickname can make those ancient skeletons feel so much more I don't know, relatable?
I know what you mean. It reminds us that they weren't just like specimens. They were real people who lived and breathed just like us.
So what's the story with Pierrette? Why do you think she'd be a good candidate for CSRA dating?
Well, they initially dated her to around 36,000 years old, which would make her one of the last Neanderthals in Europe. But there's been some debate about whether that date is accurate.
So if CSRA confirms the original date, it means that Neanderthals were still around in some parts of Europe, even as Homo sapiens were spreading out. But if the date gets pushed back,
then it could change our whole understanding of when Neanderthals went extinct, and it might challenge some of our ideas about how those two groups interacted.
it's amazing how each new discovery can potentially shift our entire understanding of human evolution.
That's what makes this field so exciting. It's all about discovery, rethinking what we thought we knew, and getting a clearer picture over time.
And thanks to tools like CSRA, we're able to ask new questions, test those old ideas, and really get closer to understanding our origins.
It's like we're finally starting to see the full picture, you know?
Yeah.
And it's way more complex and interesting than we ever imagined.
It makes you wonder what other discoveries are waiting out there, what other mysteries we'll solve. That's what keeps me coming back for these deep dives, the thrill of the unknown, the chance to find something that could completely change our understanding of who we are and where we come from.
And it's not just about the big, splashy discoveries. It's also about those little details, the tiny pieces of evidence that, when you look closely, tell us so much about how our ancestors lived.
Like that rabbit buried with the Lapedo Child. Who knew that one little bunny could lead to such an interesting conversation, right? About burial practices and symbolism and even climate change.
It just goes to show that every piece matters, and that we're all part of this incredible story, a story that connects us to our past, to our present, and to our future.
I love that. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of the Lapedo Child. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Full of amazing discoveries, incredible science, and those big questions about what it means to be human. Thanks for joining us.